Hello and welcome to the first episode of our brand new Pro podcast, where today I'm joined by two very talented tax professionals, Sunil and Mihir, who both started their tax careers with HMRC. They have since made their first move into the private practice sector, and today we'll be discussing their first move and they have since made their first move into the private practice sector, and today we will be discussing their journey. We have had more and more success placing HMRC candidates into accountancy practices in the market, and I'm keen to share some tips and guidance with any others considering this move. I'm your host, Maisie Horrell, a tax recruiter at Pro-Recruitment, and I'm really excited to embark on this podcasting journey with you today. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. So I'd love to welcome Sunil and Mihir. Thank you both for joining me today. I know we've been talking about this, certainly me and you, Sunil, about doing this for a long time now. So I'm excited to actually finally sit down and have a chat with you both. I'm really hoping that this podcast will help some people in similar positions to you guys who are perhaps at a bit of a crossroads with their career and wondering if the accountancy practice world is for them. So please be honest and let's get started. So over to you, Sunil. Are you able to give us a bit of an intro to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I work for Rawlinson and Hunter LLP as a private client consultant. But my kind of background is that I joined HMRC in 2016 in the Fraud Investigation Service. I then moved on to complete the Tax Specialist Program, which is a bespoke course within HMRC designed to train people up to HMRC tax specialism level. My last role there was in Wealthy, so I used to focus on high net worth and ultra high net worth clients. And I had a particular focus on the investment management sector.
Yeah.
So that's actually translated quite nicely into my current role.
Great, fantastic. And Mihir?
So I joined HMRC a couple years before Sunil, 2014, and embarked on the same tax specialist program that Sunil completed. My roles were slightly different. So I started off in mid-sized business, working on sort of medium business compliance. Then a few years later, I moved into large business and focused on transfer pricing. And that's what I do now at Deloitte. So I'm a transfer pricing consultant in the financial services transfer pricing team.
Great, amazing. And I guess just sort of taking a step back and thinking about, that time when you were both at HMRC thinking about making the move. I often get asked by candidates, when is the right time? When should I make the move from HMRC to a practice environment? When is a good time to do it? When is too late? And I guess, I'd be really interested to hear from you guys at what point in your career there at HMRC you thought, right, now's the time. And I guess what drove you to make that move?
For me personally, I was kind of actively thinking about my career as I was going through the tax specialist program. By the end of it, I knew I would have been at HMRC for 6 years. And I was quite aware of the culture. I was quite aware of what my development path would look like and the kinds of work that I'd be doing. I was quite happy working in a technical role at HMRC and Wealthy, but what I found is that I kind of hit a ceiling at a point where the work became a little bit repetitive for me. I wasn't quite finding the challenge and stretch that I was looking for. And inadvertently, I'd actually bumped into someone that works at KPMG. And I had a conversation with them about the practice sector and what it's like, and just sought their advice. And, one really good piece of advice they gave me was don't delay transitioning into practice after you finish the program. And it's turned out to be really good advice. I think the longer you're at HMRC, the more ingrained you become in the culture there, the ways of working. But when you make the move to practice, you quickly realize that certainly commerciality is a big factor and your time is very valuable. Personally, I would encourage people to think about it. And if they're keen to have those conversations and start kind of putting steps down towards that move as soon as possible.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So I moved after around 8 years at HMRC. So I was there for quite a
bit
while,
longer.
I'd say. But to be honest, when I joined the tax specialist program, my intention was sort of to never remain at HMRC, but I thoroughly enjoyed the role. I worked in a great team, so I did stay longer than I initially planned. But I think, so I had a different sort of route. So I finished the tax specialist program, I moved into a different role, and then I also completed the CTA while I was at HMRC. That was some advice that someone had given me, try and do the CTA while you're at HMRC rather than moving into private practice and doing it there, because the work-life balance is slightly different.
Yeah.
So that's the approach I took. But I guess it's a personal decision when you move. But I do agree with Sunil. It's probably better to move earlier on if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also ties in with a couple of other things really as well, is, the grade that you look to go into an accountancy practice, whether it be Big Four or a mid-tier or smaller accountancy firm. I think you don't want to have your expectation too high on your shoulders from day one with that move, because we're going to come on to it in a bit, but there is quite a lot of upskilling involved in the move. And I think if you've got a big salary on top of that as well, the expectation that you're going to know what you're doing from day one is so much higher. So I think it ties in with salary, making the move at the right time where you don't have to take a pay cut, I think is quite important. But also the CTA, I think that you've obviously touched on it, Mahir, but most people that I move from HMRC into private practice don't have the CTA. And again, we're going to discuss it a bit later on. But typically, accountancy practices want you to do that. So again, you ideally want to make the move, if you're not going to do it at HMRC and self-fund it yourself, to make the move earlier, get that study support in the accountancy practice, get the exams done, and then be able to actually sort of crack on with your career. So I think it ties in with a few different things as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned there what grade you come in to practice at. And I'm quite an ambitious person. I wanted to try and move at as high a level as possible.
I remember the conversations with you.
Exactly. But in actuality, over the last kind of 18 months since I've joined practice, I'm quite grateful that I joined in the grade that I did. It's credit to, I guess, the partner who hired me there. They recognised that it would be quite an upskilling process, and it would be quite a steep learning curve. And I think that's why it's really important that you choose carefully where you go to work. If the people recognise, what level you're at, what they're going to be expecting you to do, and can kind of facilitate that transition and support you through it, it's very important.
Yeah, agreed. And I think same with you, Mahir. I remember having similar conversations. It was very much, I want to go in as a senior manager, Maisie. And I remember saying to you, yeah, so do I. That would be great for me as well. But, we've got to think about you here and the expectation on your shoulders and give you that time to develop and then make that move to that senior manager level. Are you kind of glad that you went in as a manager?
Yeah, definitely. So I completely agree with everything Sunil's just said. And I'm actually really grateful to you and the partner that hired me, that I went in at the position I went into, because the sort of aspect that you have to really consider at those senior grades is like business development and that sort of thing, which I hadn't done at all at HMRC. So I'm really grateful.
Yeah,
would have been a real struggle if I'd gone in any higher.
Yeah, I think a lot of partners always say to me, we don't want to set somebody up to fail here. We want them to come in and feel comfortable and give them the space and the time they need to upskill, rather than, them feeling like it's too much and ultimately leaving, because that's not good for anyone. So I'm hopeful that bit of advice will help other people as well, because, I appreciate everybody's ambitious and wants to, progress as quickly as they can, but sometimes you've got to make that sideways step in order to allow yourself to move forwards.
Yeah. And I think on that point, I think if you do join let's say you are able to sort of perform at the grade above, whichever grade you join at, they do recognize that, and you will be promoted in the next promotion cycle.
Yeah, exactly. It will happen. I always say that to people. It will happen. That progression will come when it's ready. And sometimes being over promoted or being promoted too early, it's actually going to knock you back, I think. But there we go. So I guess just also thinking about the differences between your day-to-day role at HMRC and your day-to-day role now in a practice environment. How different really is it? Because I think a lot of people say to me, you know, what am I to expect? What is the day-to-day expectation of me? And I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners to kind of understand that from your experience as well.
So for me personally, I found my day-to-day role at HMRC at the grade I was at, which was grade 7 when I left. It was very much up to me almost to manage my own compliance cases, to manage my own kind of work, certainly with other teams. I did a fair bit with policy, and just having that kind of almost hands-off approach. I thrived on it. I did really well with it. But equally, I did find at times that I was almost looking for work.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always the easiest to come by. So the difference for me between HMRC and practice in that respect on a day-to-day is that you're never going to be short of work in practice. There's always something to do. There's so many moving parts. As we know, the legislation is changing all the time.
Yeah.
People's personal circumstances and their objectives are changing all the time. And obviously there's the compliance cycle, which starts again every April for us in personal tax. So it's knowing that you'll be occupied and just kind of having that almost determination, I would say, like just to keep going and working through it. I've certainly found at times that it's been a bit kind of challenging day to day. You might find that your workload is heavier than you can deal with. But I think that's where it's important to speak to colleagues, certainly in my experience. Just knowing that you're never expected to be completely through your workload. It's just a case of managing what's urgent and what's, priority needs to be dealt with kind of today, and then kind of rolling over work and making sure you hit those hard deadlines. Whereas there's not so much of that in HMRC.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So at HMRC, you could probably tick things off your to-do list and you wouldn't have anything left on there like at the end of the week. Whereas at Deloitte now, I don't think I haven't done that since I've joined.
Haven't got to the bottom of the to-do list yet. It's ever growing.
Yeah, but it's good because there's an abundance of work, and you get involved in like a wide variety of different projects, both advisory and compliance in my case.
Yeah.
Which is brilliant. So I think in the last sort of 9 months, I've learned so much.
Yeah.
It's definitely been very useful to me.
Yeah. Is it weird sort of advising clients from the other side of the fence now? Because previously, obviously working at HMRC, you're advising from a HMRC perspective. Now you're advising clients, I imagine similar types of clients, but just on the other side of the fence. I mean, does that make any difference to your role, or is it fairly similar?
Well, I think the technical aspect of it is certainly very similar. Your technical basis, whether you're working in public sector or in practice, is very similar. So if you understand one, you can pretty much understand the technical basis of the other.
Yeah.
But I think what's very different is your communication style.
Right.
So HMRC, as I mentioned before, tends to be quite reactive. It's more about looking at risks and opening up inquiries and kind of working those through investigation, obviously to close them off and try and bring in some yield. Whereas when you're in practice, it's very different. You're almost trying to plan for and kind of prepare individuals in a way where they're happy with the tax liability at the end of the year. But also, from our perspective, it's about ensuring they're fully compliant and kind of almost mitigating any potential risk that might arise. And I find the communication style is very different as well. So how you communicate advice to clients and write to them is very, very different. because they may not have the technical basis. So you have to get the key elements across of what you're trying to explain, try and help them structure their affairs in a way which is going to be compliant. And you have to work with other advisors, other external advisors, to also ensure that happens. Whereas HMRC, often you're writing to other experienced tax professionals, you can be quite technical and go into a lot of depth, which HMRC officers often do.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions a lot of my clients ask in an interview process is, how would you clearly articulate this really complex piece of tax advice to me if I didn't understand anything about tax? And I always used to think, God, what, why do we need to do this? But I think it is purely because of that. Your clients don't necessarily know anything about tax, and specifically not the complex stuff. So you have to be able to really articulate it quite clearly. Is that something that the firm that you've moved to has helped you with, or is that just a communication style that you've had to kind of develop yourself since joining?
I found a lot of support in that respect. A lot of our communication is kind of, the partner is the front end of that communication and tends to sign off work before it goes out. So there tends to be like a 3-level review process. Often advice will go out without much kind of changes. But certainly when I first joined and wrote advice, there was a lot more kind of markup and corrections on the advice I was sending out. But that's part of the process, I think. You can learn very quickly how the communication style is different.
And you can get better over time. And I guess it's nice to have that safety blanket, knowing that someone's going to review your work before it goes out as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. What about you?
Yeah. So sort of in addition to making things, simplifying like complex tax issues, you also have to be aware of like the tone of your message. Whereas at HMRC, you have the power, you are the tax authority. So things are written in a certain way. So that's one thing. But the other sort of aspect, which was very different for me, was understanding like the commercial aspect of things. So at HMRC, you very much focus on the technical and how things should be read, how the law should be interpreted. Whereas you don't really consider all of the commercial aspects and like, for financial services, regulatory aspects. That's been my most difficult, I think, sort of stumbling block since I've joined. But I'm sort of getting to grips to it now. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's a real change in environment, isn't it? Because it is much more of a commercial, consultative environment, and kind of switching your mindset from not necessarily having to think that way to all of a sudden having to be a bit more commercial and try to spot opportunities where you can cross-sell work, or even internally building your network within Deloitte or Rawlinson and Hunter and being able to, work across multiple teams and I guess just sort of understanding the process of how that works. Is that something that Deloitte have kind of helped you with, or is that something that you think you've picked up yourself and over time will get better at?
So I think, no, the team have been very supportive, because I think they're very much aware that that's one of the aspects that you don't really cover at HMRC. So all the partners and directors have been very supportive but you do pick it up. Yeah. You pick up on it anyway, and it's sort of you just start to naturally see that side of things when you're doing like pieces of work or speaking with clients.
Yeah, I guess thinking back now to when you were both at HMRC, do you think there's anything that you could have done to help yourself with this transition in terms of the commerciality part of it? Because I think, if there are people who are at HMRC thinking about making this move at some point during their career, is there anything they could be doing now internally at HMRC to really help them with this transition?
For me personally, I think it's difficult to get kind of exposure to how practice and how firms write to clients and communicate with them whilst you're at HMRC. But one thing I would certainly encourage, and which I think would help, is something that Mihir was just talking about. It's understanding the context under which people are organising their tax affairs. I think at HMRC, a lot of people think that everything is tax driven. So the whole world revolves around tax, and it's just not simply the case in people's real world circumstances. And probably for me here, it's more like corporates. It's more about what they're trying to achieve and their objectives commercially, as opposed to what is going to be the tax effect of what we're doing. So I would certainly encourage people that currently work at HMRC to sit there when they're looking at their cases and try and see just beyond the numbers and see beyond the legislation, and just have a real think of how has this all come about, what kind of planning's gone into it, what circumstances have led to maybe an error in their compliance. And if you try and put yourself in the what they call the customer's shoes, I think that will go a long way to helping your transition when you move to practice.
I guess it's just thinking a bit wider, isn't it? Thinking outside the box a bit more, rather than just thinking about what you're doing and what's in front of you. Thinking beyond that.
Definitely.
Yeah, completely agree. So yeah, it's good to take a step back and think about why someone has sort of put this structure into place, etc. Because what I've learned now is that most things aren't tax driven. There are other commercial aspects, and tax is just one of the considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And just thinking a bit more on culture, I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the differences between culture at HMRC versus culture in an accountancy practice environment, whether that be a Big Four or whether that be more of a boutique firm. Again, there are differences between the boutiques and the Big Four in terms of culture, but I guess looking at it more widely from, the differences between that and HMRC culture, it's a question that I get asked a lot, because I know flexible working at HMRC is very good. I wouldn't say it's necessarily better than what you have now, but I think it's different. But I guess more widely, culturally, how does it differ?
So actually, on that point about flexible working, I think Deloitte are more flexible than HMRC at the moment, because Deloitte don't have sort of X amount of days in the office. People just tend to go in when they need to be in, whereas at HMRC I think there's 3 days in the office as a minimum. So actually Deloitte are very flexible. Even working hours, if you've got something to do in the middle of the day, you can block your time out and then come back to work. It is. So I guess in terms of like culture, it is much more fast paced. At HMRC, you could be working on something that could take years to resolve, whereas here you're sort of getting to the end of something in a few months, which actually is quite nice from a satisfaction point of view, because you actually get that sense of satisfaction when you complete a piece of work.
Yeah, and you can move on.
And you can move on rather than being stuck on something for years. And the work-life balance is slightly different as well. I have to admit, I probably worked less hours at HMRC, whereas here my workload is slightly bigger.
I agree with everything Mihir said. The work-life balance, admittedly, is better in public sector, and you've got a bit more flexibility, and the holiday allowance is always going to be better. You have the ability.
Pension's always better.
It's a big draw. It is a big draw. You have to factor that into your remuneration package when you decide to leave HMRC, which a lot of people don't actually consider, I feel. But, I wanted to touch on something with the culture, and that's the leadership at HMRC. So I was lucky enough to work across many different teams at HMRC, and I encountered some leaders who were very inspiring, very bright, very driven, and knew how to manage well. And that led to a great team culture and being able to almost work at your optimum whilst feeling supported. But it's not across the whole organization. I certainly found myself in teams as well where I felt a bit siloed, unable to communicate with colleagues effectively, unable to collaborate on projects. And it's not ideal. It can really demotivate someone who's especially driven and wants to do a good job. So it does vary depending on what area you end up in.
I think also on that point, the culture, people are a lot more, well, I find a lot more driven to progress at Deloitte, whereas at HMRC, not everyone's looking for the next promotion or the next step up, that sort of drives you as well, almost. You can see the clear path to progression.
Yeah.
So there's that cultural difference from that sort of stems from that.
Absolutely. I tend to find as well a lot of HMRC individuals I speak to have perhaps kind of reached a level in their team where they can't really go any further, and then they almost get moved into a different team or a different role completely, and that's the only opportunity that they will have to progress to the next level. I think also I was talking to someone the other day about, I can't remember what grade it is, whether it's grade 6 or grade 5, I don't know. But you might know better than me. But I think there becomes a point as well where you're very removed from the tax technical work itself. And if you want to progress at HMRC, you almost become a manager and you're not really seeing or doing any of the tax work yourself. So your opportunity to progress or to make that move, and I guess that comes back to my point at the very beginning about when is it the right time to move? I guess if you are at that level where you're completely removed from the tax technical work, moving elsewhere is going to be really hard for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. And certainly one that affected me while there. Yeah. I didn't want to make a transition into management because I genuinely enjoy the technical element of the role. But it does, once you get to a certain grade, it does come to a point where you, as you say, are very removed from the tax technical. Yeah. And it's more about people management, especially if you're looking after a team of 100 people. You don't have much capacity or time. And then you become, I guess, dependent on other people as well, knowing that they have the technical knowledge. And it can be difficult to actually pick up almost if someone's not done the work that they're supposed to, or you find what they've put together is not quite right. It's not easy because you've also got to sign off on that. Yeah. Whereas I feel in practice it's different. You've got a whole variety of colleagues that you can approach who you can bounce ideas off or, check your work and, get that kind of feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I guess moving on to your specific firms now, so Rawlinson & Hunter and Deloitte, what have they done to help you with your transition into practice? What support have you been given, I guess, both by the firm more widely or by specific partners or directors or people in the team with you? Have they put you on any training courses or have they, given you a mentor? What's the sort of training, and support been like?
Yeah, so at Deloitte, you have a lot of people there to support you. So firstly, I think my team has been very supportive and they're full of very experienced tax professionals. I've been assigned a mentor, a coach, a people leader who are all approachable and very, very friendly. When I first joined, I was given access to like a SharePoint with loads of technical like slideshows and slide decks that you could that were quite helpful for me to learn more about the industries that I was advising on. And in addition to that, in the transfer pricing team at Deloitte, we run like a yearly like a transfer pricing technical training program. So in fact, I helped organize that last month. So we've just finished that round, which was really good. But I guess the main thing is that people are just very willing to help and share their knowledge. I think a lot of people genuinely enjoy talking about certain tax issues and they want to get involved.
Yeah. And I think it's about maybe, being confident enough to ask for help when you need it, because I think the transition is quite tough for some people and I think tougher for others that perhaps are a little bit more nervous to ask for help or, feel a little bit lost and don't quite know where to turn. But I think just speaking up and asking for support on something or asking somebody's advice or asking them to check over a bit of work that you've done will help you to develop.
Yeah, I think I'm that kind of person. Yeah. So I'm a bit more reserved and won't just reach out. But my team are so good. We have a lot of like team building that we do. Yeah. So you really get to know everyone. And even I feel comfortable like, reaching out to people.
That's good. That's good. What about you, Sunil?
Yeah, same for me. I can't say a bad word about the culture and support I've received at Rawlinson & Hunter. From the get-go, I was assigned a buddy and also assigned a manager who was kind of looking after all my HR related things. But then with every case you work on, you also have a manager and a partner assigned to it. And anytime I had any queries, they were more than happy to take the time to actually sit down, talk things through, and just kind of guide you to where you needed to be. It was especially poignant for me because I joined in the final 3 months of the compliance cycle when we really needed to be on it with preparing tax returns, and having never prepared a tax return before. That was
thrown in the deep end, weren't you?
Fire, yeah. So I'd recommend you don't do that. Really pick your time.
Timing is key. Yeah.
Exactly. Pick a quieter time of year to join.
Well, you can counter argument that by you probably learnt a huge amount in that period of time that you might not have done until the next compliance cycle, but you live and learn.
Yeah, absolutely. My hairline suffered.
Gone grey overnight. Okay. And I guess a question on client interaction, because I often get asked this by individuals thinking about making the move and wondering, do you get a lot of autonomy with managing those client relationships? Or, how does it work, I guess? Do the partners hold a lot of the relationships and the work is delegated down to you? Do you still day-to-day get client relationship sort of experience? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So for me, I think it depends on the partner you work with. But the partners on my team, I wouldn't say they necessarily hold the client relationship. You would be communicating with the client personally, calling them, emailing them. There might be some, certain interactions which are reviewed by a director or a partner before they go out. Yeah. But generally, I think the team are quite keen to get you involved and help you build that relationship with the client.
Yeah, because ultimately that's going to help you progress to the next level, isn't it? Where that autonomy, I guess, will become a little bit more. Yeah, I guess you won't necessarily need your work to be reviewed as much as you progress. So they're kind of preparing you for that in advance. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's slightly different to what Mihir's experienced. The partners at my firm certainly hold the client relationships. But that's not to say you don't have opportunities to engage with the client. I think for the firm, reputational risk is a big factor because we focus in the majority on individuals, who the face is and who has the risk and who has the responsibility. Yeah. Ultimately, it falls on the partner. But I have found with time that as I've put communication together that goes out to clients, albeit with the partner's name, the higher quality of the work that you're producing, the more likely you're building kind of that trust within the firm and with the managers and the partners. So within quite a short space of time, actually, I've now started to take on quite a lot more of client engagement, which has been really positive and really good for my development. Ultimately, you've got to understand that it
doesn't happen overnight.
Exactly. It is a process, I would feel.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think the level of autonomy at HMRC is a lot higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it comes with pros and cons, I guess, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about qualifications? And again, this is something that I think is at the forefront of the market right now because, tax qualifications, whether that be CTA, ATT, whether you do the ACA, CTA or ACA on its own, they're notoriously tough exams to do. They take a lot of your time. And I think what you tend to see in the accountancy practice environment is most people will have one, if not two or three qualifications. And it is seen as a necessity for them to do that during their grad program. Whereas at HMRC, I know they put you through other areas like the specialist program that they put you through, which I've been told is very hard and almost as hard as doing the CTA itself. But I don't think it's necessarily something that accountancy firms look at and will, take as a qualification, I guess. I know there are some people at HMRC that do some of the exams. I think you have to self-fund it. Yeah. And I know a lot of people don't want to do that because it's not cheap. But ultimately, in my opinion, I would advise everybody to do it if they can. I think it will help your career. I think it will help you progress. It will help you become a more well-rounded tax advisor. But I guess I don't know whether HMRC are doing it maybe on purpose and not sort of funding the CTA route for individuals because they know they might lose them to the accountancy practice environment. But what would your advice be on qualifications? Do you think it's something that you should have done at HMRC, Sunil? I know, Mahir, you self-funded it at HMRC yourself, but can we just kind of discuss that a bit?
So actually, so in the transfer pricing world, HMRC do fund the ADIT qualification.
Yeah.
In large business, it's quite for large business sort of tax professionals, it's slightly easier to get that funding. They might have a larger budget for it. But I was very ambitious, so I did it myself, and I would say it was really difficult.
Yeah.
I lost a lot of weekends. Also, I did it the cheap way, so I didn't go to all the revision tutorials and all the classes, which probably made it a lot harder. But I do actually know someone who joined Deloitte a few months before me at the same grade, who didn't do the CTA, and he's doing it now, and the firm are funding it.
Yeah.
So I guess it's up to the individual. It doesn't stop you from moving, but it does give you sort of a really good basis of broader tax knowledge. It sort of helps you to see things from the other perspective of an advisor rather than a tax authority as well.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a personal choice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I tend to find that accountancy practices will be more interested in interviewing a HMRC individual if they have done the CTA or an ATT or an ADIT. And I think it also shows them desire to develop and progress, both from a technical perspective, but both from a career perspective. Because if you've taken the time to do that yourself and self-funded it, it shows, that this is a career that you really want. But I guess from your side, Sunil, you didn't do it, did you, at HMRC, but you're doing it now?
Yeah, that's right. So I elected not to do CTA while I was at HMRC, purely because I just come straight off the tax specialist program and I just finished doing exams. So I did consider delaying completing my CTA and then transitioning into practice, but equally, I didn't want to delay diving into practice and starting to learn what the culture is like, what the work is like. So the support you get in HMRC for your study is quite a bit more generous. You tend to get a day a week for tutorials. You get a very generous package for kind of time off for your exams. And obviously in practice, it's not similar to that. But I also think from a practical application point of view, so I'm currently studying inheritance tax, trust and estates, the advanced technical level. If I had tried to study that while I was at HMRC, I wouldn't have had much opportunity to actually implement that in the real world and understand how it applies in practice. Whereas the firm I'm at now, it translates over very nicely, and I've got quite a lot of casework which kind of aligns with what I'm doing. So it ends up being that it sheds light on the theory as well as the practical side of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it is very personal, like you said, Mahir. I think it's independent on the individual and their circumstances. But I always advise people, if you can do it as early as you can, because otherwise life gets in the way. You start thinking about buying a house, having a family, and thinking about, your weekends being taken up by studies is no longer quite as doable, really, realistically. So I always say, do it as early as you can, get it out the way, and then be able to focus on your career. But, I don't think it's necessarily the be all and end all if you don't do it, but I certainly think it will help you.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think after you finish the TSP exams, if you can get started on that within like a year, you're still in that sort of mindset of sitting exams, which makes it slightly easier, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I know nobody likes doing exams. I certainly wouldn't want to do the CTA, but there we go. And I actually want to touch on, I feel like I'm jumping onto something completely different here, but I do want to touch on the interview process with you both, because again, that's something that a lot of people come to me and ask about. The interview process, from my perspective, is fairly similar, whether you're moving from an accountancy practice to another accountancy practice, or whether you're moving from HMRC to an accountancy practice for the first time. But what was your experience of the process? And, how did you find it?
So for me, the process was really easy because of you.
Oh, thank you. I didn't pay him to say that, I promise.
So I think we first spoke about the role in like January, early January. And I think I got an offer by the end of February.
Yeah.
I had 2 interviews. The first was with a director and an associate director in the financial services transfer pricing team. And then I spoke to 2 partners. I found it a very straightforward process, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you, thinking back to it now, do you feel that you needed to prepare for it? Was it quite technical? Were there sort of any challenges throughout the actual interview process itself that you struggled with, maybe that sort of commercial aspect, or any sort of tax technical issues that they discussed with you? Or did you actually find it fairly simple?
I found it fairly straightforward. I think we discussed some of the commercial aspects beforehand, which really helped. I think I spent like a couple of hours preparing before the interview, and then we spoke. Yeah. And then I sort of did the interview over Teams.
Yeah. Do you think that doing the whole process over Teams was enough for you to understand, the role, the culture, the environment, or do you wish you'd kind of perhaps done one stage on Teams and one face-to-face?
So actually, I prefer face-to-face. Generally for any meeting. But for me, it was okay over Teams because I'd spoken to a few people who had made that move, spoken to yourself about the role. So that really helped me sort of understand what I was getting into. But I do find it's easier to build that rapport over like face-to-face rather than Teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing a lot more now in the market is it is shifting from a 100% process being done via Teams to 50% of it being done on Teams, 50% of it being done face-to-face. And I quite like that balance personally, because the first stage over Teams is a bit easier to get in the diary. You can get enough of a feel for, is it something you're interested in or not? And then that second stage kind of gives you a bit more commitment from their side. You're also showing commitment as well, but also you get to really understand each other a bit better. So I try to advise people now to do that face-to-face, at least one stage of it, if you can. But anyway, Sunil, what was your process like? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think all the points that you guys have raised is absolutely valid, really useful. So for me, I hadn't interviewed for a role in about 3.5 years, maybe, prior to applying. And before I joined this firm, I had interviewed with 1 or 2 others. So I had the kind of opportunity to experience an interview, kind of get a feel for the kind of, sort of questions they were asking, what they were looking for. But equally, I think when we started talking about the role at Rawlinson and Hunter, Maisie, that your guidance was very invaluable. You kind of highlighted what they might be looking for, what kinds of elements would be tested during the interview, and just generally what to expect, as well as giving me some hints on maybe what to kind of research prior to the interview. Although it sounds really kind of basic and straightforward, sometimes these things are really easy to overlook when you're nervous for an interview. So the first stage for me was done over Teams with a partner, and it was, I think, more focused on understanding if I'd be a good fit for the culture, what my kind of aspirations were, and what kinds of things I was looking for. And especially important for anyone that's currently working in the public sector, have a real good think about what your desires and motivations are for leaving the public sector and wanting to join the private sector, because they will ask you that question. Absolutely. And then the second stage of the interview for me was in person. It was face to face with the senior manager and the same partner. And like Mahir, I also find it much easier to build rapport in person, and I find myself to be quite personable. So I like to get in front of someone and kind of have that discussion, have that opportunity to really show what I'm about. But also, as I alluded to earlier, for me, it was really important that I joined a place with the right culture, with the right environment, with the right kind of work. So it was also an opportunity for me to kind of almost investigate what I'd be going into as well. So
yeah, absolutely. I also find as well, I think, you know, using a recruiter that has an understanding of the transition, the upskilling, what's involved, being able to manage expectations, but also, more importantly, actually understanding where the right firm is for you out there in this very vast accountancy practice world. You know, there's so many different types of firms that you can join, whether it be Big Four, top 10, or, you know, a top 100 firm. They're all great in their own right, but they're all very different to one another. And not every firm out there is going to suit everybody. So I think, you know, it can be quite a daunting process thinking about the move. You can kind of feel like a rabbit in headlights. Where do I apply? Who do I speak to? What's the right role for me? What's not? You know, what type of culture is going to suit me? Does it have the flexible working that I need, etc., etc.? There's so many different things. And I think using somebody or using an agency that knows that and can help pinpoint where the right place is for you, I think is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll wholeheartedly support that. Working with a skilled and experienced recruiter, as you say, it demystifies the process, and you almost have to like take your hands off the wheel a little bit and trust that the recruiter knows what they're doing and kind of gets to understand what you're looking for and what might be suitable for you.
So I'd always sort of been against using recruiters.
Oh, okay. Come on then, spill the beans. What's wrong with us?
So I sort of saw it as they've got a role and they want to put someone in that role, so they'll put anyone in that role to you know, sell it. But I've changed my mind now. So I going forward, I think I'd always use a recruiter I'd use that would be an option if I was moving around. But initially, you know, I didn't see the advantages to it. And I always avoided it even when I was looking for like graduate roles, got approached by recruiters, just ignored everything. Wouldn't respond.
Interesting.
I don't think you're wrong in that respect either, because now that I work in practice and it's all over my LinkedIn, I get approached by a multitude of people all the time. And I'd even worked with one or two prior to starting to work with you. And I think you're right to have those fears as well, because there's definitely recruiters out there who are trying to kind of push numbers and get people into firms so that they can earn their commission. But I didn't feel that way with Pro in any way, shape or form. I think you guys were really patient, really helped me through the process and made sure it was right. But ultimately, that leads for a better outcome as well, I feel. If you're just getting placed in any firm, in any role, then there's a chance that you might not fit in and might not enjoy it and it might not be successful.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's about building trust, because there are a lot of recruiters out there, like you said, who have perhaps given the rest of us a bit of a bad rep. But I think that, you know, for me, I don't look at it as in, I want to make money out of you now. You know, it's about building that relationship. You know, I might not help you make a move for 2 years from the first time that we speak, but it's about building that relationship so that you trust me and that I can, you know, provide you with the right opportunities that would be of interest rather than just anything and everything on the market. So I think having that relationship with a recruiter is important, but enough about that now. I'm not going to go on and on about it, but just coming back, just a last couple of questions for you. I think this will bring it to a nice close and summarize everything that we've discussed today. But I guess, what has been your biggest challenge with the transition itself? And what advice would you give somebody who's sitting perhaps in your shoes a couple of years ago and thinking about this move?
Personally, I'd say do it sooner rather than later, before you really get ingrained into working a certain way. And also be ready to sort of start working at pace and being almost more efficient than you are when you are at HMRC, because you have different performance sort of indicators. I think that's it, really.
Yeah.
I think for me it's been accountability. At HMRC at times, as we've discussed a little bit earlier, you can kind of work on your own workload, be the decision maker on how a piece of work goes out. But when you transition into practice, all of a sudden you're very accountable for your time, your chargeability, and everything that you're doing. It kind of has to drive towards some sort of billables for the client.
Yeah.
And also delivering value for money. So one thing that I kind of found challenging at times was almost delivering accuracy, but also being efficient in doing so. But what's been quite useful is that the firm understand that, and they do support you. And I think that's where, I think, Mihir, you're talking about being a little bit on the reserve side before.
Yeah.
I'm the same. But one thing that I've learned is that it's very important before you start delving into spending a lot of time on a piece of work. If you're not quite sure what you're doing or what direction you should be taking, or you just want to check in, it's always better to check in and speak to someone and kind of get a second opinion on it before kind of taking it any further. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, completely agree.
Amazing. Well, I think that brings us to a really good ending. Thank you both so much for sharing your journeys with us and for taking the time to talk to me today. Really, really appreciated. If anyone listening to this does want any support, any advice, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm sure Sunil and Mihir wouldn't mind you also reaching out to them with any questions that you've got. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you.